All right, welcome to the latest edition of The Free Lunch, where I like to meet for a lunchtime chat with somebody that I find engaging, interesting, stimulating, somebody I admire and look up to. And that person that I have with me today is Claire Smith, somebody that I've had the pleasure of working with in the past and who is currently Claire's gone through an evolution in terms of, first of all, starting out as a lawyer and then becoming more of a business development, sales kind of person, and then into a third area of her career, which has been in the people area. And that is where she is now, in fact, just starting a new role as head of people quite soon. So I'm very excited to hear from Claire about how she feels about this area. And Claire, I'd love to hear about that journey you've been on that's led you into this area.
Oh, great. Thanks so much for having me today, Eddie. And you're absolutely right. My career has taken a little bit different route, perhaps what I thought it might. And I believe it's now called a squiggly career. There's even a name for it. So I started off life as a solicitor, as you said, and then transitioned into business development. And my ego says it's because I wasn't really a great lawyer, but I think it's the fact that I didn't see myself sitting behind a desk managing hundreds of clients through a computer. It was more I like getting out, speaking to people, and that's why I moved into a business development role.
Okay.
So I was in business development and made a career out of that for 15 years. I love being around people. I love talking to people. I love listening to people, influencing them. Being a lawyer helped me to manage stakeholders at all different levels. And you meet so many different people as a lawyer that really stood me in good stead.
Uh-huh.
But the business development, 15 years in business development was really great in continuing to build on those relationships. And as you say, working in a sales environment as well.
Right.
And I kind of I stumbled into people and culture really. And I've always taken opportunities that have come my way. And after 15 brilliant years in business development, I was made redundant. A lot of people were in COVID. And I took a first job I was offered, still in business development, but in financial services. And what I'd done at that stage is I'd learned a lot about people and culture. I'd been in environments that had amazing cultures. And when I started in financial services, I remember the very, very entrepreneurial CEO saying, bring some of that culture stuff with you. I think we need a bit of it here. And that gave me a platform then to showcase everything I'd learned having been a beneficiary of amazing workplace cultures.
Uh-huh.
So the Sunday Times used to sponsor best companies, and I'd been within a law firm and also a call centre that had both been ranked top three best companies to work for. So I'd picked up a lot of experience, so I was able to show what it meant to have a brilliant culture, and I'd also lived and breathed it, having been a beneficiary of it. So I took the CEO up on his offer to bring some culture stuff along, and that just gathered pace. And in 2021, within the financial services company, moved into a full-time people and culture role. That CEO just took a chance on me.
Hmm.
Very grateful for that. And I was able to build a people team, and that has continued to grow and grow. And this is what I now call my third and favourite career. So a
Hmm.
squiggly career, but one I'm very, very happy where I've ended up in people and culture.
So what does a head of people do?
Well, I think it's the best job in a company. I think you get the chance to have a real impact on making sure people are happy, engaged, rewarded, recognised, and you are in control of creating an environment to enable people to do the best work. And you can control how people can thrive and grow in a workplace. And I think having that role of looking after everybody
Hmm.
and making sure that they feature on boardroom meeting agendas, in board packs, that people are. It's a fantastic role to have. I feel very lucky to have such a role and to be able to have have play my role in shaping how workplace should be.
And so you talk about culture. What can you talk a bit more about what you think is a good culture, if you like, from your experience?
I mean, culture for me, it's a bit like brand, isn't it? It's like gut feel, I think, a lot. The Sunday evening feeling
Mm,
of how you feeling about going into work the next day. Cultures that have made me thrive and I've seen others thrive are where there are a set of values that are lived and breathed and are very genuine,
hmm.
but those values that are led by behaviors from the top, and
Right.
it's top down. So for me, organizations with great cultures have a strong leadership who live and breathe the values of the company, and they're not just written on a wall or on a, do you remember the old mouse mats? Kind
Hmm.
of, they're not just there for you to look at. People are walking the walk and talking the talk. So for me, a good culture starts with authentic leadership. And I think sometimes people think that culture is just about the people at the top and what they
Hmm.
set as the values, but it's not. It's got to be top down, involving people to create those values. Things that stand out to me are things around inclusivity, kindness,
Mm.
friendliness, supportiveness. There's a whole range of values and words, but it has to be married with the behaviours that people see from the top down.
Yeah, it's really
So yeah, great
interesting.
culture for me.
It's really interesting. Where does a culture come from, isn't it? Like, is it
Mm,
is it created or is it just sort of happen? And therefore, the
yeah.
company kind of grows up in a certain way, and perhaps people weren't setting out uh, to create a particular culture, but their behaviors did create one. And then it's amazing how somebody new can come in at the top and then actually can completely change the culture
Yes.
in a matter of days. And what about if there is, because you were talking about a lot of very nice, warm, cuddly things about people
Mm.
feeling good and kind of warmth and kindness to other humans, if you like. What about when the culture requires there to be really tough business kind of achievements to be made? How do you think that you balance the kind of warm, cuddly stuff with the delivery and the hitting the target stuff?
A really great question, and something that I've debated before about high performing cultures. And I think, what does high performing culture mean? Does it mean about that people need to display the behaviours to hit targets, do their job really well, be innovative? It depends. For me, it depends on where is the business trying to go, and
Mm,
what behaviours do you need, and what traits do you need to be able to get the business where it needs to be. Do I think you can do that with kindness? Yes. Do I think that not all cultures are super positive? Yes.
mm,
You hear the horror stories about what cultures used to be like in organizations like Brewdog or in
mm,
Amazon. That won't suit everybody. And
mm,
also, those companies come under, kind of real kind of scrutiny for
mm,
how it's what it's like to work there. Um, I think if you're striving for growth, for example, and you need high performance, what does that mean? And you really need to break it down to what that means for people.
mm,
And I've worked in organisations, like you said, if the culture's what it is,
mhm.
then somebody will new come in and challenge that, and they can make it better, or they can strip it back and make it worse.
Yeah,
And I think it's a really interesting point
I
around
certainly.
what culture do you have at the moment? It'd be a question I would always ask a business. What do you think you've got right now, and test it?
Mm.
Test it. Is it what you think it is right now?
Absolutely, and I 100% agree with you about how important it is. The behaviour of the leaders. They, I always say, and I think it says somewhere in my book there that um, the leaders give permission to the people further down in the organization to behave in a certain way. So if you are always turning up late, or you shout at people, or use bad language, then people in your organization will do the same thing. And if you're, on the other hand, are very efficient and you turn up on time and you're very polite and you never lose your cool, then it's much more difficult for people in your team to behave like that. So there's no
Oh,
question.
totally. And I think, yeah, I totally agree.
I think the bosses do, but then on the other hand, I think that you're right that there's things that can be done. So tell us, I'd love to hear some of the things that you've done and worked on to kind of go about building a culture. and I guess what you're really talking about is strengthening a culture, right? That you hopefully you've got a culture
Yeah,
already.
there's definitely looking at strengthening a culture, but there's also looking at what you have today.
Hmm.
And organisations I've worked in, one particular organisation, they were starting to see some challenges around growth, engagement, churn, Glassdoor scores were poor.
Right.
The business was doing well and they believed they had a great culture, but the cracks were starting to show in areas that you would expect HR people leaders to be, you know, fully in, kind of like aware of. So that was a case of having a look at what the culture was and what was going wrong because churn was creeping up and these Glassdoor scores had kind of like fallen. So testing where the culture was, and that required a piece of work to go out and speak to all employees via a survey, but also speaking to groups and focus groups to ask them what they loved about working in that organisation, what they wish could be done differently, and what they wanted to see happen in the future.
Right.
And what that drew out was yes, people enjoyed working there, but out of almost like loyalty because they'd been there a long time. So they liked each other, but they didn't necessarily like some of the way that the leadership were running the business
Yeah.
and certain decisions that were being made or how they were being made or how behaviours were manifesting themselves. So I think first of all you have to look at what the culture is today versus what you think it might be.
Hmm.
And also then look at where do you want to be. And then you can look to take the bits that are brilliant and strengthen them.
Yeah.
So if people all love the people and they feel it's friendly and inclusive, build on that.
Hmm.
But for example, one of the areas we identified in that organisation was that people felt that everyone worked in silos. The
Right.
departments weren't working closer together, and that was affecting the performance of the company
Hmm.
because people weren't collaborating properly. So what we then did was look at what behaviours would define people to collaborate more
Right.
and did workshops to help improve collaboration. So we built on the strengths of the business of what worked well, but then looked at where what we called those the strengths and what you needed to work on, we called those the stretches.
Right. Okay.
So identifying where those gaps were because that was starting to have an impact on business performance, like people worked in silos.
Yeah.
And that, communication was also a huge gap. So if you were one of the people that had been in the business for a long time, you heard things before perhaps people who weren't in the business a long time
Right.
heard. So
Right.
communication
Mhm.
wasn't key.
Yeah.
And it was also interesting to look at the demographic of people who'd been in the business a long time and those that had joined in the previous 2 years because they felt a very different culture because they
Yeah.
weren't in the clique.
And I think a lot of
So
the
I think
times,
looking at what you have today is key.
a lot of the times that perhaps when you've got an established company and it works well, and that it's so important to keep listening, isn't it, to people. What I once did some work with a company that was very, very successful, but the message that came back was we don't communicate enough. So yes, we do communicate and messages get sent out and that kind of stuff, but we're growing very fast. And I don't like it that I'm walking down the corridor and I see someone coming towards me that's clearly been hired recently, and I don't know who it is. And I don't know why they've been hired or whether they're kind of like higher up in the hierarchy than me or lower down the hierarchy than me and what they've been
Yeah.
hired for. And this was a relatively easy fix for this company, and actually it was really just a lack of sort of like corporate self-awareness of the
Yeah.
leadership, that they were moving so quickly as that so much was happening. um, I also feel like it's about getting the right balance, don't you think? Because the for example, how you treat people who aren't performing, that's tricky, right? Because you could argue,
Yeah.
well, a nice culture is very generous and they let people have lots of time to work it through and all that kind of stuff. And then after months and months, that person finally has to leave. But that can have a pretty negative effect on the people who are doing great work. So that
Yeah.
finding that kind of consistency in how you deal with things when they're going well and dealing things when they're not going so well, I think that's also part of how a culture begins to work effectively, if you like.
Yeah. Really, great point. And I think for as long as I've been working, the challenge has been with people struggling with difficult conversations.
Right.
And it goes back to communication, that nobody likes to have a difficult conversation. Whereas I believe it doesn't have to be a difficult conversation if you're open and transparent. And I was taught, talk to people about what your expectations are. What do you expect from them as a new starter, or what do you expect from them as a team member or as a
Yeah.
team?
Yeah.
And talk about what good looks like. Have an open communication, have regular check ins, but keep checking in. Are we on track?
Yeah.
Are we on track? Because then there shouldn't be any surprises when something doesn't quite go to plan, and you need to have an open and honest conversation about, we said we were going to deliver X by this date.
Yeah.
What's gone wrong? Because it hasn't been delivered. And I often find that as well, there's a gap in people understanding their individual role in the overall company vision.
Yeah.
So, you're better at analogies than me, Eddie. But if we've all got a part to play with the jigsaw, where's
Mm.
your piece on that jigsaw? Because if your piece doesn't go in,
Right.
the whole picture's not going to be completed. And what I try to do in the teams I lead and the organisations I've worked in is ensure the vision of the business is shared and understood.
Mm-hmm.
And that, and I talk about Sharon from finance,
Mm.
that Sharon from finance knows the role she's got to play
Yeah.
in helping the company achieve its goal. So, do I think difficult conversations have to be had? Yes, of course they do. But I think we can learn as leaders and managers to manage the whole process of what expectations are,
Mm-hmm.
and having regular check-ins that we're doing what we say we're going to do, we're on track, and then just having a conversation about if we're not.
Yeah.
That it doesn't do any good. And I've had this myself, where you told every single check-in, you're doing a great job, you're doing a great job, you're doing a great job, and then out of the blue, I'm not very happy with you. And
Yeah.
you're like, crikey, where has that come from?
Yeah.
And there shouldn't ever be any surprises, should there? Well, I don't think there should be
There
anyway.
shouldn't be.
But I've
Yeah, a couple of thoughts come to my mind. One is to your point about, one thing is what you as a leader want to say, you as a leadership team, whatever. The other is,
yeah,
what are people hearing, right? And there can be a
yes,
disconnect there, right? So Sharon from finance, you may think that you've given a very clear message that Sharon from finance should have understood perfectly.
yeah,
Big surprise to you to discover that actually she hasn't understood at all and is completely in the dark, and getting more and more concerned about the company or something. And so I think you've got to check that. I remember once being involved in a big internal communication project in a big company, and we did a survey, and 42% of people completed the survey, and there was a lot of really, really good data, and the people involved were very, very happy with this. But I did make the point, well, 58% of people couldn't be bothered to fill it in. So
yes.
you've always got to be very careful, I think. And then the second thing is, just my view is, you can't communicate too much. And I think
I
sometimes
agree.
bosses feel like, oh, there's nothing to say. Well, fine, say there's nothing to say. Because unfortunately, the human way that we're all created is that as soon as there is a vacuum, we'll begin to fill it with something. So as soon as there isn't
Yeah,
any news, we start filling it with some. When somebody leaves the company without good explanation, then we fill up that vacuum with stories about, completely made up somehow or other. How that happens, no one really knows. But somehow those stories get made up. And so I think that constant communication fills that vacuum and stops people from kind of inventing things, which
totally
is.
agree. Totally agree. And communication for me, people will rely upon the fact they sent one email about one topic 6 weeks ago.
Right.
Well, if it's really important, it can't just be one email. Is everybody are all the heads of departments or line managers briefed? So if people come to them with questions, has it gone out in internal communications? Whatever tools you've got at your disposal, whether it be a platform, whether it be digital screens, whether it be via an app, you can't just rely on messages to be sent once. And people are really, really busy digesting hundreds of pieces of information every single day. I know, there's a very simple model I use. What do you want people to know? How do you want them to feel? What do you want them to do?
Right.
And getting into a routine, certainly I've done in previous roles, into a routine of regular communications every single day.
Yeah.
but a Monday might be a business update. Tuesday might be something from the tech team about a new product or a product launch. And then, through the week, and Friday used to be a kind of bit of a roundup, but also introducing, back to your point earlier, new starters.
Mm.
Let's welcome all these new starters. This is what they're here to do.
Yeah.
And just that regular communication is something that I think people overlook and don't spend enough time doing.
And
And
yeah,
it nips so many things in the bud. And I think, sorry, just on that point of
yeah.
communication, I've been in many organisations where somebody will quote something that was said 3 years ago and
Mm.
hasn't been addressed since then. In my previous role, it was a removal of an annual bonus.
Mm-hmm.
This is a really emotive topic, and it had been removed 2 years earlier.
Right.
But somebody had an email that said, we will replace it with something.
Yeah.
And it had never been addressed. It had never been replaced. And one of the things I wanted to do was address this email that someone was hanging on to physically and electronically of, okay, are we going to be able to do anything about bonuses? And then address it in a way of either, yes, you can, and this is what we're going to do, or no, we can't, and this is the reasons why, and almost put that to bed.
Yeah.
And I think, this goes back to leadership behaviours and how others see you and the impact of your behaviour on others and what you say, what you do. A leader had said they were going to do something and then hadn't done it.
Yeah.
And that was still a topic of conversation 2 years on for about 25% of the workforce. So think about wasted time and energy. So one of the things I strive to do going into an organisation and going to new organisations is, bring out the dead. What are the ghosts? What ghosts have we still got haunting the corridors here of what had been done in the past? Or my other favourite, talk about Sharon with finances. Oh, it'll never work. We tried it once in 1985 and it didn't
Right.
work. Okay,
Yeah.
well, let's just have 5 minutes on why it didn't work then.
Yeah.
Right, just tell me, why didn't it work then? Brilliant. Okay, you've been listened to your point. You've had your voice. Okay, well, this is why we think something new might work.
Yeah.
But yeah,
And I
you
think
can't do enough communicating.
totally linked to that, the leaders underestimate their power, right? So they have tremendous power. So when they say something, like as you say, I mean, I have been involved in a situation relatively recently where a senior leader made a kind of a off the cuff kind of, well, we're planning this event and we're very excited because we're looking forward to inviting you all to take part in this event. And then things changed. And so guess what? That event didn't happen. And a lot of people were extremely disappointed. And honestly and truly, that leader couldn't even really remember that they'd said that. Because for them, it was just a sort of throwaway about something that was going on in their head. And for the people who were hearing it, it was an amazing opportunity to do something exciting and interesting. So I think that's extremely important. The other thing that I think is interesting is, as you know, I work with the DISC
Yes.
personality profile, where you kind of look at how do people work, how do they like to think, how do they like to process and communicate with each other. And we do have different personality styles. So I think one has to be careful that the way we're communicating as a leader is not just our way, right? Because you're going to have different people in your team. So you might be, in DISC, you'd be, the I, the influencer, yellow, and it's all about kind of enthusiasm and standing up and sort of banging your chest. But that maybe doesn't fly with your group of conveyancing lawyers who spend all their day hammering away at the computer conveyancing people's houses. And so you've got to kind of think about how you communicate as well as what, right?
Yeah, totally agree. And you have to really think carefully about how you want people to receive that information.
Right.
And I think in person, fantastic. Via Teams, great. Back it up with a nicely designed kind of one pager, get it on your intranet. Just so then, and also there's one version of the truth out there for everybody. So
Mm-hmm.
if you were there to hear it, great. If you weren't there, you can read it and you can see it, and you're all hearing the same thing at the same time.
Yeah.
I also fully understand though that you can't communicate certain things until they're about to happen.
Yeah.
So I'm not sitting here thinking you've got to tell everybody everything about your business. It just really helps leaders to share what you can when you can
Yeah.
and nip things in the bud quickly, particularly rumours,
Yeah.
nip them in the bud quickly. And I mean, this lends itself completely to the me-pathy approach and the
Mm.
concept that runs through the book, and not just having empathy, but also having me-pathy as a leader,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Understanding your
And
impact. And I think senior leadership team can have me-pathy as a group, right? In terms of how does the rest of the company perceive us? Do they think that we go off into a room and talk all day and we never know anything about what happens? Is there a way to create an information cascade? Um, don't know if you've heard this one, I'm sure you have, but the two people that people like to hear from. They like to hear from the big boss or bosses, and they like to hear from their local person or maybe their immediate boss. And so when the big boss has made a big speech on video or something, and then you turn to your local boss and you say, oh, I didn't really understand that point about that new factory we're buying in Switzerland. And they say, well, I don't know anything about that either. That's a terrible look, right? And that's a
of course it is.
failure of that senior leadership to put the information into the hands of the local boss to make sure that you've got an aligned message going down. And to be honest, it's not particularly easy. It's hard
No,
work.
no, it's not. It's not easy, but I think having some structure to how you're going to communicate. And there were companies that thrived in the pandemic. They
Mm,
thrived in communication by communicating constantly. And there's those that shied away from it, that then it was real difficult, to get the troops behind them when, kind of it's all systems go getting back into the offices and things like that. They'd not heard from their leaders regularly enough. But yeah, I think the whole approach with me-pathy is something that I definitely try to work on and try to build on. How am I perceived as a leader? I ask for feedback from people who work with me alongside me, and it's not, you want the truth from people, and sometimes you're thinking, oh crikey, is that how I come across? But it's so
mm,
powerful then to be aware. And there's many leaders I've sat around tables when they've got no idea how they're coming across and how they're being perceived.
right. Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean,
And
I think having a misunderstanding about your own empathy is really, yeah, can be a critical flaw for a senior leader. Because
yeah,
and
definitely.
even both ways. I mean, sometimes people can be really actually a lot more effective than they think, and that lack of self-confidence can be just as damaging as somebody who thinks they're amazing. I mean, to be
Yeah.
realistic, it actually is usually the other way around, right? Usually people are not as good as they think they are. Um,
It is. It is. And I had a colleague in a previous role who was part of the exec leadership team, and was one of the responsibilities, which I was used to make Somali, he was responsible for pulling the board pack together.
mhm,
And every month, even though we all knew we were going to the same board meeting and we had to do it, every month he'd start an email with, sorry, it's that time again.
right.
And I ended up saying to him, as a colleague, as a peer, why are you apologising for doing your job?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
you don't need to apologize. We should be coming to you and saying, here's the pack ahead of time. But actually, I think those leaders that perhaps, have lower egos and aren't aware of their position as a leader should think, crikey. And I've done that in a few roles. I've coached people not to apologize for doing
Right.
their job.
Well, I think apology. I
And I
mean,
think,
certainly, for example, in things like when you're standing up in front of a group of people, and people have that terrible habit of kind of starting with an apology and saying, I'm sorry we're late. I'm sorry the traffic was bad. Um, I'm not a very good presenter. My slides are rubbish, and there's something wrong with this microphone. And you're sitting there thinking, well, thought you were going to entertain me. It's not a good start. But also slightly different but connected theme is people evolve, right? And so cultures evolve. And something that you may have not spotted it in the book, but I have this slightly controversial bit where I say I'm really against calling business things families, because I don't think they are families, because families are
I
families and
agree.
they have good things and bad things about them, and businesses are not families. Um, and one of the things that I realized, and I worked in a company where I worked there for 16 years, and there was an evolution, and there were people who 15 years before had been absolutely key, and 15 years later were beginning to become less key. And this kind of love relationship that we have with our jobs, right, and a firm, and we feel part of it, and it's kind of like, yes, this is me, and it becomes part of their own, that person's culture. And then they suddenly begin to feel like, oh, this company doesn't love me anymore. And
Yeah.
I can't believe it. They're talking about moving me into that other department or changing me across here. And, well, it's not my fault that I don't know that new programming language, whatever it is. And it can be extremely upsetting for people. So that's all part of the culture as well. And I think that one has to keep a track of that evolution, right? Which is
Yeah,
probably also linked
completely.
to the business goals. I mean, when you're a startup with 8 people, you've got a set of business goals and you've got a certain culture. When that grows to 80 people, it's going to be different. And 10 years on, you've got 8,000 people. If you still got the same culture you have in year 8, it probably aren't probably very healthy.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I fell into the trap many, many years ago, thinking about the whole concept of it's all one big happy family.
Mm,
I've evolved my thinking on this because last time I looked, there was no unconditional love for me from my peers sitting around a boardroom table. But do I think you can have a workplace where people can come to work and feel safe
yes.
and motivated, and that they're working with colleagues where there's a mutual respect to achieve the same goal? Yes. You mentioned the colour profiling before. I know I'm not everybody's cup of tea, and nor should I be, but that doesn't stop me being able to work brilliantly alongside somebody to deliver on a project. And that goes back to, like you said, the shared vision, the values, the
Hmm.
behaviors. And what some companies I often hear, well, what did you have to create the values? You have to embed them. You have
Yeah.
to embed them in every single bit of your business for them to really work. But then you need to revisit them.
Yeah.
So just because you've got values, or as we used to, call them in one of my organizations, your DNA, those behaviors to get you where you wanted to get in 2025 might not be the same behaviors and values to get you to where you want to be for 2035.
Right.
And it's okay, but I think people worry about they spent all this time and investment on this first round of looking at culture and values. They worry then, do they need to do it again? And yeah, you do need to evolve, particularly because of all external factors
Yeah.
as well.
And I think that
And you need
it
to
can get
reevaluate.
it can get complicated because w- I think, but if it top down values, they,
Mhm.
and the ideal situation probably is that somebody comes up with a set of values that they think describe well the company, and then everybody has a chance to contribute to that conversation and say, yes, I think so. I think this is what we're like, and all that kind of stuff. But then the boss may have more like an aspirational value, right? And
Yes,
then that can be complicated. And in the end, how what your values are and how you live them kind of is the culture, right?
of
So
course it is. Yeah.
it's very. I personally for companies, I prefer the kind of the sports team type analogy. And if we're going to have an analogy, I definitely don't do families. Quite apart from the fact that most families I know are incredibly dysfunctional. Um, but also that if you think about sports teams that I know that you're from Manchester, and a few people like Manchester United, and the 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 Manchester United that you support if you go there this afternoon is completely different from the Manchester United you supported 10 years ago. There isn't one single person. The manager's changed about 4 times. The players are all totally different. And yet you support the club and you're still very loyal to the club. And I think that companies, and the people while they're at the club are very well treated. So there'll be a very strong culture, and they're going to be well paid, and they're going to have very nice facilities and training and all that kind of stuff. And then when the time has come, I'm afraid it's time for you to move on. It's kind of very understood, right? No one's going to turn around and say, well, I've been playing here for 3 years and I can't believe it now. You don't want me. Well, I'm afraid that's because we found better right winger than you. And that's life. And they get it, right? And even though it's quite a tough message, it's a consistent one. and
Yeah.
the people will move on to something else. So they will say, right, I know I've done my 3 years here. That was great. I was a very good right winger while I was here. And now I'm going to go and play for a second division club and earn, a little bit less, but I'm still happy and I'm still know what I'm doing. And I think
Yeah.
this is, I think there's this sort of idea, people get this idea that they join a company and that's it. They're there forever and they can hold on to their chair. And I like, for example, I like the culture in a lot of bigger multinationals where they move people around a lot, but they make it clear that 2 years is about what we would probably expect you in this job. 3 years would be 3 years would be a bit unusual. 4 years would be never happen.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And I think you
and
see that with different generations now. I'm a firm believer in helping, people grow within a business if they
yeah,
want to, personal work-life balance is different for people, but if they want to grow and they're ambitious. And I always remember a colleague I used to work with called Scott. He was a brilliant entry-level social media exec. He wanted to be chief marketing officer.
yeah,
I loved it. I loved it. He was bright, high energy, ambitious, and I knew we'd never be able to keep him because there was just not the opportunities within the organisation. But that didn't stop us helping him progress as far as he could to set him up then to be able to apply for the bigger job
yeah.
in another organisation. And guess what? He gave a brilliant Glassdoor review when he left because I
Mm,
believe that you give people the red carpet treatment on their way in and if you can on the way out.
yeah,
And Scott got development, investment, coaching from the business to help him be able to move on. And I think that's okay. And I think that's okay. And I think those people that love that stability and security of where they are, I think that's great as long as there is an awareness that the business is evolving, the world is changing,
yeah,
technology. I'm really struggling to keep up with the advances in technology, and I'm a huge fan of AI at the moment and ChatGPT and all that. I think it's fantastic. But it's kind of, oh crikey, what's going to come next?
yeah, yeah,
And yeah, I think I see different people now, particularly post pandemic. Expectations have changed, work life balance requirements have changed, and I think the good thing is people are more aware of that now.
yeah,
And if you're an organisation that has open conversations about learning, development, flexibility, work life balance, that's great.
yeah.
But we can't take away from the fact that we are all paid to do a job.
Absolutely. No, I think
And
such an interesting conundrum. I
yeah,
agree with you completely because, funnily enough, once again, I think it was a bit controversial, but people would, when I worked in a large company, and as usual, there's quite a lot of people who are not that happy about something, and they would come and talk to me and say, not very happy, blah, 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 blah. And I would actually point to the traffic in because there was a big motorway near my office, and I would say, "Look at all those people. None of them work in our company. There's many, many other places you can work. If you're not happy here. It's up to you to make that choice." And I think sometimes there's a bit of an idea that the company should do certain things for you because you've been there for 5 years or 10 years or something. They should put up with you and your funny ways. But it is a balance
yeah,
because we want people to feel they belong, but then you can't also, if we go back to the sort of the Manchester United analogy, you can't have somebody sitting in their armchair with their slippers on the right wing. It just doesn't work, and so it has to
yeah,
be
I agree.
evolved.
And there's a great model called the Each model, where you treat employees as adults, consumers, and humans.
Oh, nice.
So some of the things that I follow that model, and some of the things that talks about, which you touched on being controversial, is putting it back on the employee.
Right.
And there's a couple of examples I've used where someone will say, "Well, I've not got a JD." Well, I'm not going to write it. I don't do your job. If you want a JD, then please, you put together what you think your JD is, and
Mm,
together with your line manager, looking at some objectives and goals. But it's your role, so please, let's see what you come up with as a start for 10. And second of all, if somebody's really unhappy, I've coached managers to ask them, "Do you still want to work here?"
right. Absolutely. Yeah.
Which is very controversial and could backfire, but having open conversations about, for example, you never want to come into the office. you don't want to put your camera on. Your teammates invite you out on a couple of events, you don't fancy it. You've been late for the team meeting, or there's an and just help me understand. You don't seem very happy, and that's not great for you. Do you still want to work here?
Right.
Because there's this fear that you can't have these open conversations. And yes, of course, we've got employment law and protection for employees, and of course for businesses. But I think it's okay to ask. And I coached a line manager to take that approach, and it was a massive relief for the employee.
Mm.
Massive
Yeah,
relief.
because there's definitely people like to externalize these problems and feel that the company is responsible for this. Oh, there's a terrible culture. Okay, well, is there a terrible culture, or is it that you don't fit in the culture? And that you might be right. Perhaps there is a terrible culture, but perhaps there's a culture that just doesn't go with the culture you're looking for. And the more that people, I mean, it's
Yes.
actually back to me-pathy. It's about that kind of understanding of what you are looking for, what you're doing, what you're searching for. And I think you're completely right. I'm a very big believer in that you own your own career. And
Yeah.
if you're happy in a company or in a job, that's great. But you can never just sort of sit back and say, "Oh, this is great. I'm in a wonderful position, and I'll be here for years now," because it doesn't happen. Similarly, with pay rises, that conversation about, "Oh, I think it's time for me to have a pay rise." "Oh, are you doing something different?" "Well, no, but I've been doing it for 3 years." "Well, and you got a bonus for that. You got a bonus for working really well and delivering against your results. But you can't be paid more for doing the same thing."
Yeah.
And
Yeah. And I
actually,
think you're absolutely right. When it comes to the whole performance and approach to, I hate appraisals.
mm,
I'm not sure we worked together if we ever actually did them, but I didn't. I'm not a big believer in these lengthy forms to be completed once a year, and for line managers to think that's their one opportunity to then bring out everything that they don't like about their team member. So I've moved very much to, again, this employee-led approach of regular check-ins
yeah,
and having healthy, valuable conversations. And actually, going back to your point on listening and hearing, getting the employee to play back after the one-to-one. So you've agreed, right, we've had a great month or a great 2 months. We've agreed for the next couple of months you're going to focus on this. Brilliant. Do you want to just drop a note or a Teams note or whatever you want to use, but for the employee to make a note of what you both agreed to?
yeah, absolutely. Well,
Because
I'm
what
a
you
yeah,
said before about listening and hearing, I've fallen foul of that. Definitely hearing something to what my boss has said. And I often try with my teams to make sure that we're on the same page, and that there's no misalignment there.
absolutely. I mean, so I very much believe it's so important to have those one-to-one meetings. That the person who it isn't the boss's job to prepare the agenda; it's the person who's the
Yeah,
employee. They need to feel responsible. It's their meeting. They get half an hour with the boss. So what are they going to get from it? And actually think about, rather than, "Oh, I've got the boss today," is like, okay, I've got half an hour with the boss, how can I benefit in some way from that? And then similarly at the end of the meeting, to your point, that that person would be expected to send a quick note saying, "These are the things that we agreed, and these are the action points." And the boss is completely able to do the same thing if they want to. If they want to reinforce something with a one-line
mm,
note, I think these little processes and structure can really, really help. Because when you sit down again in 3 weeks, and it's like, "Oh, well, I didn't realize I was meant to do that." Well, just hang on a second. Well, it's in your note. It's pretty clear. Oh, that's true. Now,
yes,
maybe uncomfortable, but it's also helpful. Um, I also have this thing I call sacred spaces, which is to have a regular one to one, not all the time, maybe once a month, once every 6 weeks, which is not just about the business, not just about the projects, it's about the person. So the sacred space, and the reason I call them sacred spaces is because they shouldn't be moved. Because the problem is that the boss thinks, "Oh, well, this is the one where we chat about him as a person. So we don't need to do that. We'll leave that till next
yeah,
month." But no, it's actually really important. And because very often we can be communicating all the time about work, about clients, about projects, about problems, but we're not actually communicating about people or about feelings or about how we're feeling at the moment in our job. So I do think all these things, and of course, one of the issues is all this stuff takes time, right? Um, and
Yes,
a lot of people
it
don't
does
have much
take
time.
time. Yeah, and I think the appraisals are a great example. Removing them from an organisation will free up hours of time and moving towards meaningful conversations, regular check-ins with less
Like a rolling.
paperwork.
I do think
Yeah,
objectives are important. And in fact, when going back to when you and I worked together, initially there weren't any objectives, and
yeah,
you may have forgotten this, but my thing was just for everybody to have one objective written on a piece of paper somewhere. And I think if people don't have a clear sense of what they're meant to be doing, and I like short-term objectives, I think I totally agree with you, that kind of annual kind of thing, and then you meet again in 1 year, it's ridiculous. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. It's
well,
often,
things
often,
change.
of course,
Things change.
it's often tied to bonuses, and I think that the problem is the bureaucracy begins to overtake the usefulness of actually that system. You needed a system because there wasn't a system, so a system gets put in place, and then the system becomes unwieldy and unfriendly. Which is once again back to your point that you've got to be constantly working on these things and working on the
Yeah, and
culture.
having those conversations, and quite often, when I'm in an office, my one-to-ones will be a walk around the block.
Yep,
Let's get out, go for a walk around the block. It doesn't need to be a formal check-in, particularly, an old colleague used to say, "Oh, you're taking me for a well-being chat," and we'd have a laugh. And I went, "No, I just want to know how you are."
yep,
Away from the office, like, "How are you? You've just had a new baby, you okay?" Just that general check-in, and forget, leaders are human beings, at the end of the day. And I think, yeah, I think the way we lead has evolved and changed so much over the last, 20, 25 years I've been working, as the cultures have. And for me, great leaders need to be aware of that, which
yeah,
it comes full circle to the whole
yep.
the Me-pathy concept back in the book.
Mm. All right, amazing. Well, look, amazingly, we've been talking for 47 minutes, and I don't like to take up your whole lunch hour. So I think perhaps we'll wrap it up there. But I don't know, Claire, I've really enjoyed this conversation. It was so interesting,
Definitely.
and I hope you'll come back on again in a few weeks. And I wish you a lot of luck in your new role. And I think that the
Thank you
people
so
at your
much.
new place are very lucky to have you, and
Oh, thank you so much, and
championing
thanks again for having me.
championing their culture. All right, talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye, Claire. Bye.